Afternoon, everyone. My name is Molly Gray. I serve as Lieutenant Governor of Vermont, and I'm so excited to be here today to help moderate an incredibly important and critical panel on the first proposition around universal access to affordable broadband for all Vermonters. And what does that mean for our Vermont society, community, family, culture, and so many of the different aspects of what makes Vermont so special. Before we dive into the meat and the elements of the proposition, I did want to do a few sort of housekeeping items and address those. One, this is an event where we are trying to encourage as much participation and as much inclusivity as possible, given that we're all on Zoom. So I am, for anyone who has a visual disability, I will describe myself. Again, my name's Molly Gray. I serve as Vermont's 82nd Lieutenant Governor. I was elected in November. Normally I do sit in the State House, but now that the session is done, I'm in my home office. I've got sort of short brown hair. I'm wearing a turquoise blue shirt. And I do have my window open. So if there are any bird sounds and that gets too loud, I will shut it in a moment, but great to have some fresh air. There's also closed captioning, so you can turn it on or off as would be helpful. And this event is recorded. We are going to allow a lot of time for participation and questions from all of you participating and joining today. You can pose a question in the Q&A portion of the Zoom screen at any point, and we'll get to your questions near the end of the discussion. But again, we're leaving a lot of time for that. Before I introduce our panelists, I do want to frame today's conversation. Again, this is the Summit on the Future of Vermont. The VCRD has been working to bring voices of over 3,000 Vermonters into a strong statewide conversation around a number of propositions. The first proposition being on broadband access, universal, affordable, quality broadband access in Vermont. Sounds a lot like childcare, and the truth is it's quite similar. And today we're going to talk about the tools, where we stand here in the state with deployment. What does that look like? What is the data? What we do know is something like 60,000 homes and businesses today still don't have access, or roughly 1/4 geographically of Vermont. We also know that broadband access was an issue before the pandemic, but the pandemic really exposed and accelerated how Vermonters use broadband, from telehealth to online learning to remote work. We all know the list of services and goods and things that are now accessed online, but also just changing the way we access government, we access community, the conversations we have. So all of those pieces are elements of the proposition 1, and I want to read just the sort of overlying title of the proposition. Vermont must ensure affordable, high-speed broadband and cellular access for all Vermonters, while using digital tools to promote community, connection, and democracy, and to advance local commerce and economic opportunity. So we're going to get into a lot of these elements today. It's now my pleasure to introduce our panelists. I'm going to have them do longer form introductions as well, but I'm pleased to welcome Michael Birnbaum, of Kingdom Fiber, who's the founder and owner, Holly Groschner from Equal Access to Broadband, Incorporated, and former CEO of Vermont PBS, Representative Katherine Sims, who just finished the legislative session, who's a newly elected legislator from Orleans, Caledonia counties, and then Michael Wood-Lewis, CEO and founder of Front Porch Forum. So welcome to our panelists. Michael, I'm going to begin with you. Please tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll go through the rest of the panel.
Sure. For the visually impaired, I am hair impaired on the top, but not on my lip and chin. And I'm more gray haired than not. I wear glasses, and I'm wearing a bright orange shirt suitable for work safety. I have 4 current roles. In 2020, I co-founded, a wireless internet service provider. And in 2018, I became a charter member of the CV Fiber Communications Union District, Board of Governors. In 2016, I founded Kingdom Fiber, which is a fiber optic-based internet services provider. And in 2005, I co-founded Cloud Alliance, a wireless internet service provider. And prior to that, I've had multiple careers, primarily doing non-technical communications on the community level, first in Chicago and since coming to Vermont in 1968.
Thank you, Michael. And we'll go to the other Michael, Michael Wood-Lewis. Michael, welcome.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. And I'm really pleased to be here today. My name is Michael Wood-Lewis. I'm co-founder and CEO of Front Porch Forum. And by way of physical description, I'm a white male with dark brown hair and glasses and a dark shirt, sitting in an orange room. The other Michael would blend in quite well here. This shirt with some nature photographs on the wall that one of my kids took. Glad to be here today.
Thank you, Michael. Representative Sims, great to see you. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Lieutenant Governor, and thanks to VCRD for this opportunity to be talking about such an important issue. I'm Katherine Sims. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a white lady with brown shoulder-length hair and bangs, and I've got an orange summer dress on, and I'm zooming into you from the basement of my family's camp in Lowell, Vermont. And as the Lieutenant Governor mentioned, I'm a first-term legislator, state representative from Craftsbury, Vermont, serving the 7 towns of Albany, Barton, Craftsbury, Greensboro, Glover, Sheffield, and Wheelock. I also work as a nonprofit consultant, helping bringing organizations together to do good work. I previously served as the director of the Northeast Kingdom Collaborative, which set strategy and helped move projects to action in the Northeast Kingdom. I also serve as a representative on the Northeast Kingdom Communication Union District Board, and I serve on the Vermont Telecommunications Advisory Board as well. I'm delighted to be here with you all.
Thank you, Representative Sims. Holly Groschner, great to see you. Welcome.
So glad to be here, Lieutenant Governor, and thanks again to everyone who's attending this session. Of course, Vermont Council on Rural Development does such a great job for all of us. I have recently retired as the CEO of Vermont PBS and was part of the team that organized the collaboration and integration of VPR and Vermont PBS, which is going to preserve public media for Vermont. Just prior to that, I was general counsel for the Vermont Telecom Authority, and we worked on both broadband and mobile cell phone service for Vermont. But really, I've spent 30 years as a telecom lawyer working at sort of the intersection of where new technology meets communications. And that took me all the way out to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where I ran the legal department for a publicly traded company called Crown Castle International. We deployed $4 billion worth of infrastructure and built a network that the cell phone carriers thrive on. And through that work, I became very familiar with how networks operate and how we use wireless and fiber communications to connect us. Through my work at Vermont PBS, I became really adamant that we all need equal access to education, and in this time, equal access to broadband. So I'm especially happy to be volunteering now as the chair of Equal Access to Broadband, which has made its cornerstone finding a way to help small Vermont telcos, CUDs, and independent telephone companies, ISPs, everyone that's in need of connecting neighbors, find a way to make broadband more affordable. Thank you.
Thank you, Holly. Well, we've got about an hour and 5 minutes, and we have so much to cover. Again, I just want to remind everyone joining us today, please feel welcome to put questions into the chat box. We want to get to them. We want this to be a really inclusive, dynamic conversation. There's a lot to cover, but I think the most important thing in starting this conversation is recognizing this moment, this really exciting moment for Vermont. And I don't know if VCRD knew that there was going to be $150 million advance for broadband just days before this panel. But I think the most important thing is setting the table, sort of figuring out where we're at now. And the best place to start is with Representative Sims. Could you talk about sort of how the elements of the proposition are now being met through a lot of the work that the legislature did over this last session with the help of Senator Leahy and the American Rescue Plan to sort of set out a framework for Vermont to address some of our broadband needs?
Yeah, thanks for that question. The good news is we are making significant steps towards implementing and achieving the elements of the broadband proposition. So I serve on the Energy and Technology Committee, and knowing how important the issue of connectivity is to all Vermonters, we spent much of this session doing a deep dive into broadband and building on the work of the committees from the previous years. And our focus has been on building a network to serve all Vermonters. We took extensive testimony throughout this year from the Department of Public Service, independent telephone companies, broadband companies, the communication union districts, legislative council. So many folks were in there telling us what's working, what are the gaps, and how we can bring broadband to everyone. And so this all fed into H360, an act relating to accelerated community broadband deployment, which passed the House and Senate this session and is now awaiting the governor's signature. So H360 dedicates $150 million of federal stimulus funds this year to the construction of broadband infrastructure in the most underserved parts of the state, and anticipates spending a total of $250 million for broadband deployment over the next 3 years. Before diving into the details of the bill, I wanted to start by sharing just a little bit of context about where we are and how we got here. One kind of important piece of framework is the Federal Telecommunications Act of 1996, which prohibited states from regulating internet service. And that assured us that a competitive, unregulated landscape would provide Americans with the best and cheapest internet. And for many Americans, that worked out okay. But I think, as many of us know, for rural America and really much of Vermont, it has been a disaster. Because rural Vermont is a less profitable place to provide internet service because of our geography and sparse population and a number of other factors, private internet service providers have been less willing to build here. And in addition, federal programs designed to subsidize the build out of broadband have sort of fallen short of reaching the most remote regions in our state. And so, as the Lieutenant Governor mentioned earlier, unfortunately, 25% of Vermont households still lack access to basic broadband service. And in our committee, we heard again and again from the experts that no one is coming to save us. The good news, though, is that we have a path forward to accomplish universal service. In 2015, Vermont established a new type of municipality, a communications union district, whereby multiple towns can partner together to develop coordinated regional solutions for broadband connectivity. CUDs are accountable through their governance structure, where the board is made up of a representative from each of the member towns. Initially, there was only one CUD in Vermont, EC Fiber, which has been highly successful in connecting dozens of towns in the Upper Valley. And today there are now 9 CUDs working across the state, covering nearly 80% of Vermont towns. And so H360 focuses the technical and financial support on our community's efforts on reaching the unserved and underserved by distributing public funds as a part of a plan to provide universal coverage. The bill does 5 things. First, it will provide grant funding to CUDs for pre-construction expenses. And so that might be technical engineering work and design, utility pole surveys, make-ready work, which has to happen before you do any stringing of fiber. Second, the bill provides grants for building broadband infrastructure to unserved and underserved areas. The funding would be directed to 3 different types of eligible entities. First, communication union districts, the CUDs. Second, a small communications carrier, and that's defined as a carrier that operates in no more than 5 Vermont counties. And third, an internet service provider who is working in conjunction with the CUD to expand service as a part of a universal plan. Third, the bill establishes a Vermont Community Broadband Board, and this will be an entity to coordinate and support all of the CUDs and their partners by providing technical, legal, and financial assistance to help accelerate the deployment of broadband. They'll be the entity overseeing the distribution of those pre-construction and construction grants. The bill also creates a property tax exemption for new broadband infrastructure owned by an electric distribution utility for when it's used to help provide service as a part of a universal coverage plan. And lastly, the bill expands broadband workforce development programs in partnership with Vermont Technical College and the Vermont Department of Labor, knowing that we're going to be doing a significant amount of work deploying broadband across Vermont, and it's necessary for us to sort of accelerate the pipeline of job training so that we have enough workers to help build and maintain these networks. Overall, the bill is really prioritizing the deployment of fiber, so future-proof infrastructure to give all Vermonters access to at least 100 megabits per second upload and download speeds. And, in sum, I think we're really pleased in all of the work that has gone into this bill that it will advance this broadband proposition by bringing partners together to create a universal plan and mobilize these sort of once-in-a-lifetime federal dollars to help conquer our digital divide and bring broadband to all Vermonters. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. I like that, conquer the digital divide. That sounds very active and forward-looking. That was a really helpful overview of sort of the infrastructure, right? We're talking about broadband as broadband infrastructure, but the infrastructure of how we're going to deploy a lot of the funding coming to Vermont through the American Rescue Plan. Of course, there's the American Jobs Plan. A lot of questions about, will that include more money for broadband? And what could that look like? Needless to say, Vermont's broadband story is just beginning a new chapter. I think the next sort of framing issue is really on sort of the tools and how has the tools landscape changed. And this is a question for Michael Birnbaum. To be part of Vermont society today, I think it's pretty clear that you need a cell phone or you need a computer, and you need not only the hardware, but you need the ability to access the broadband highway for so many of the reasons many of us know, but we'll also discuss today, from online learning to remote work. So the question is, what is the state of play when it comes to the tools, the infrastructure, and the technology necessary to get Vermonters access to broadband right now? And what does that look like?
Well, thanks for that question, Lieutenant Governor. So with few exceptions, to participate in and benefit from our modern society, individuals and the institutions that serve them require broadband directly or indirectly. And both government and the private sector are needed to proliferate these services. So often public-private partnerships are the best solution to get to the least served sectors of our broad community. And it's generally accepted, as Katherine said, that at least for now, fiber optic cables are the best delivery system for well into the future. But the costs to bring these cables everywhere are very high, and the availability of labor and materials are in short supply. So to bring adequate, if not best services faster, other technologies such as tower-based or low-orbit satellite-based fixed wireless are great solutions. They cost less, they're quicker to deploy, and they can be replaced by fiber when it gets there. And mobile wireless is also essential and complementary with fixed broadband. So if we are to be an equitable society, we should not expect our underserved neighbors to wait for several years for a more perfect solution. So essentially what I'm saying there is, absolutely, we want to build fiber everywhere, but we can't wait for everybody. And we need to look at all technical solutions to get as many people on now and get fiber to everyone eventually.
I think that's a really helpful explanation of the landscape. One piece of the proposition does set this goal of 5 years, right? Can we in 5 years meet the element of universal access? I want to kind of go back to you and think, is that a realistic goal for Vermont in this proposition?
I think it's close. I think there's, if the short supply of labor and materials does not get in the way, and the utilities are able to make poles ready to accept fiber optic cables, those are the factors that will delay it. If the funding is there, and key is whether all the funding will be there. And in 5 years, If the jobs bill from Congress adds funding to the rescue plan money, then I think it's achievable. I'm not sure if it'll be done in 5 years, but it's quite possible. But still, what do we do for the next year or two? Our company is going to work really hard to put a lot of fiber out, but I'm suggesting that there are towns that are going to sit there waiting, and it's not fair to them. And so we need to look at all solutions right now and fiber for everybody eventually.
I'm going to come back to you. I think there's a lot of questions on equity, but I do think it's a good transition to Holly. I think we've talked a little bit about this new framework that's really exciting, the work of the legislature, the amount of money we have. There's this framing issue around the tools, right? Fiber being future-proof, but a lot of other tools that are sort of available, and where do they fit into immediate needs? But the big question is affordability, and that is a key element throughout this proposition, right? In the same way that we talk about electricity being affordable or water being affordable, right? Broadband potentially being a public good, and how can we make sure it is affordable? So I was wondering if you could touch on that, specifically gaps in service create and reinforce inequities in Vermont. We've seen that. How does Vermont address the affordability elements of the proposition and achieve equal access to broadband regardless of income?
Well, that is a tall order, and I appreciate that you're asking the question, Lieutenant Governor. I think Michael Birnbaum's comments about availability being an equity issue are so pertinent. But as Representative Sims noted, we did great work on funding availability, but not so much work in the legislature yet on funding affordability. And I think that's appropriate, but it's challenging at the same time. Just to be clear, we've been talking about the digital divide since the Clinton administration, 1999. So this is not a new problem. We have yet to work it out. And in fact, there's no national strategy for affordability, none, which is kind of surprising when you think of the United States. In this arena, as Representative Sims points out, we are dealing with unregulated companies. So while we might talk about them as public utilities or a public necessary service, they are far from a public utility in terms of rate regulation. So broadband, if you look across the state, is pretty expensive in Vermont. Compared to a national average. It's very difficult to pin exactly what our cost structure is, because there's plans that offer a few months free. You can offer different rates of service, and different companies structure their pricing in such different ways. It is a little bit difficult to say exactly how much more expensive than the national average we are, but it's expensive. And so families do struggle to add what's perceived to be a next new monthly expense to their budgets. The problem is we're starting to learn, and COVID helped us in this way, that it isn't just a nice to have, it's a need to have. And one of the studies that was done by the Pew Charitable Trust showed that in certified low-income families, families that qualify as low income on state and federal measures, that 36% of those families said that their students would not be able to complete their public school homework because of a lack of affordable broadband. And 46% of the families said that they would have to finish their homework sharing a cell phone. So in Vermont, that would be a challenge all by itself. But I think it's just indicative of the fact that we are slow to adapt to this new service. As a nation and a bit as a state, we know we'd like to, but we don't necessarily have a strategy for it. And that's a really important factor. So for our participants, I'd just like to bucketize this a little bit. We have the availability question that Michael was talking about. I'm talking a bit about the affordability question, but there's also adoption. And adoption is the piece where we help people understand how they can use broadband effectively and maybe even save money in the long run. We're also seeing that for low-income families, those services and subsidies on which they so rely are often available only through the internet right now. That's a big challenge if you're trying to find some way to be connected with adequate service. So I guess I'd also say that, you know, we have been fortunate to be given a fair amount of money, but from the ARPA funding, and our governor was also focused on this issue, but it's not so much that we can readily build out and afford subsidies for low-income households. So there's going to be a lot of challenges in making selections and prioritizing need in a very effective way. I hope that helps. And by the way, before I forget twice, I'm a more than middle-aged woman who wears very large tortoiseshell glasses and has brown hair if you're not looking too carefully. And I'm coming to you from my office, my home office in Cookeville, Vermont, which is a village in Corinth, where there is a moose passing by outside.
Wow. Thank you, Holly. So we've talked about the tools, we've talked about affordability, we've talked about this initial kind of roadmap that Vermont is creating. I do want to move into some of the other elements of the proposition, and that's sort of the elements that move us away from like, is it fiber, is it satellites, is it remote wireless, and into like, what has this meant for Vermont, right? Our state that really values the local, right? Be it local democracy or our general stores or local economy or small schools. What it's meant for a state where we've seen a lot of divide. We've seen a lot of very, very fast change societally, culturally, with so much that's moved online. And I think Michael Wood-Lewis, Front Porch Forum has really been at the forefront of creating space. And I'd love to bring the next question to you, which is, how do we move, you know, from the elements that are in this proposition around sort of challenges and opportunities, and into a space where we ensure that broadband and internet coming to Vermont is really a force for good, right? It's a force for making Vermont a better place, however we define that, right? But what does that look like as we go through this really rapid change?
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. That's a terrific question. You know, there's no question that we need equitable and affordable access to the internet for people across, you know, our entire state, because there are so many necessary and good uses. And we've mentioned several, be it education, health, employment, et cetera. That said, as a parent of you know, several kids, school-age kids, as a human being in 2021, you know, I see personally, and I think we all have seen personally, there are many downsides that can come in on those same lines, be it fiber or a cell signal or what have you. And we need to ask this question, not just how do we get goods, but how do we prepare ourselves to deal with the bads? And I don't have any easy answers, of course, but I would love to see more work done to stimulate locally owned and operated online businesses, nonprofits, projects that have a Vermont stake and a Vermont mission. I would also love to see more work in Vermont thinking about big tech and what they're doing to us. it's not a big leap to think that big tech sees us as a colonizing entity would see, some small outlying third world country in the past. This is a place to go and extract wealth. This is a place to go and bamboozle the inhabitants with addictive, offerings. And it's super powerful and effective. But we're capable of educating ourselves and our neighbors. We're capable of building positive alternatives. We're capable of pushing back. And we need to do more of that. If this was a highway we were talking about, and the primary use of this highway was for, some colonizing force to roll in and cart off all of our timber, and half of our youth or something, we'd say, wait a minute, maybe we shouldn't build this, or maybe we should put some rules in place, or maybe we should educate our population. Maybe we should take a different approach. So this is already here, of course, these problems, this technology. But I've been hosting online conversations among neighbors in Vermont since 2000 for 21 years. And, it was a very different time in 2000. There were local projects galore on the internet, local offerings, startup efforts, experiments, and the big five of big tech have dramatically changed that climate, where it's very hard for folks to see a pathway towards building local alternatives.
I'm going to ask a follow-up, if you don't mind, and we're going to move into more of a dynamic fishbowl conversation here in a second. But have you witnessed anything over the last year during the pandemic on Front Porch Forum? I mean, more people online, more people engaging. I mean, tell us what you witnessed as someone who has created this space, as you said, for almost over 2 decades, for Vermonters to engage, something that is really special for our state, as you know.
Well, I count my blessings every day because I love my job. I get to see Vermonters often at their best, helping each other out, being good neighbors, coming up with ideas, rallying around neighbors in need. And 2020 brought that in spades because the needs, of course, were spiking all around the state. Whether it's health or economic or just organizing at various levels. And so various mutual aid efforts have of course blossomed all around the state. And Front Porch Forum is an ingredient. It's the people who are making this delicious meal, and Front Porch Forum is often a critical ingredient. We're glad to play that role. But unlike big tech, we're not trying to capture everybody online for 24 hours a day. We're just 5 or 10 minutes a day. We're a catalyst, a stimulus for helping good things happen. But I can't tell you one good story off the top of my head. There's just there are great stories every day.
Yeah, I'll come back to you. I think in this world of how do we communicate, how are we sharing information, what does civic engagement look like? And I want to move to Representative Sims on this. January 6th, I was trying to remember the date, the major uprising and riots at the Capitol, really seeing some negative outcomes from the use of a digital space, right, to create a lot of harm for democracy. But I think there's a lot of good stories coming out of this legislative session. And I certainly have some as Lieutenant Governor, and the number of people, we had 500 Vermonters come into the State House virtually. And if I may, we're having a bit of a meta moment because we're here right now on an online platform talking about broadband. But Representative Sims, what is your perspective on the future of legislating and civic engagement? This is digital democracy that we now are functioning in, which is pretty interesting, right?
Yeah, it's such an interesting time. And I think COVID really showed us what was possible whether it's, moving our entire legislative session online this year. I did not set foot in the State House this year as a first-time legislator. All of our committee hearings were live streamed and recorded. Our witnesses were able to come in not only from all across Vermont, but all across the country. We were working on some artificial intelligence and automated decision-making system legislation, and we brought in experts from California and Washington to share their expertise with us in a way that never would have happened otherwise. And myself as a legislator was even able to benefit from that. I was able to watch other committees and follow along with their testimony and hearings in ways that would not have been possible if we were all, physically in our committee rooms. I think we also saw some real innovations and in openness and transparency at the local level with our select boards, many of them moving their meetings online, allowing, again, a greater level of transparency and access than I think we'd ever seen before. Certainly there were some, bumps and learning curves there, but I hope that those are things we don't ever go back from. I would also add, as a candidate, I was able to hold office hours every month on Zoom, and I think I got more people participating because they just had to, hop on for half an hour to chat with their representative, as opposed to having to drive an hour for a short meeting. Just one other thing that I've noticed is I think a lot more trainings for running for office and getting involved in advocacy efforts that, now we're all, I think, much more familiar with Zoom and how to connect. And that creates real opportunities for civic engagement that I hope we can, learn from and find additional ways to, continue that access. And when we go back to the State House, I think, we'll continue to find ways to have witnesses Zoom in and testify and to record and live stream what's going on in that building, because it's the people's house and it should be available and accessible at all times.
So I have a question for Representative Sims, if you don't mind.
Please jump in.
There was some comments in the press and live in committee rooms from people who work with legislators who are lamenting the Zoom format. And can you speak to whether you feel like those folks were getting enough access? I know sometimes the press has been a little bit disappointed. Is there a better way to be really Zoomified?
Yeah, I think those are lessons that we're still trying to learn and figure out our path forward. I really think it's a both and. I think, again, being able to live stream every, before you could listen online to the floor on VPR, but, you couldn't see it. You couldn't see everybody's faces, and hearings were not open in the way that they are now. I was, for better or worse, sometimes watching at midnight. So you can watch in your own schedule, which is so convenient. And I think offered a level, and a reporter could be in multiple committee rooms at a time. So that increased access. But I think we also missed those quick conversations over the water cooler and in the hallway. So much of legislating happens in those, quick hall conversations, face to face. And so, I imagine that for some reporters and advocates, it felt like that part was really missing. It was certainly missing for me. And so I hope that when we go back in person, we regain that, human to human quick update. How's it going? What are you thinking on this? But we also continue to document and make available what's happening in the building, even if you can't make it to the building. So hopefully we can kind of pick the best of each and come up with something even better than before.
And Michael Birnbaum, yeah, please jump in on this one. I know you have something.
I'd like to jump in on that too. So the best of both worlds next year, when we're back in the State House and continuing to do Zoom conferences, Zoom recordings of committee hearings, would be the best. And the reason for that is that some of the people who are bemoaning that they didn't have the kind of access they used to have fairly exclusive access. And what happened this year was it got democratized. Everyone in the state had access, whether they were able to testify in hearings or not, there was more access for testimony, but everyone got to see every hearing they were interested in. And in the past, some individuals would have access every day because they were paid to have access every day. And others in the same realm couldn't afford to have representatives watching every hearing and keeping track of everything. And that's what I'm saying about the democratization of it all. You could watch at midnight, like Representative Sims said, and then fire off an email to your legislator the next day and say, hey, I saw you said that, and I wonder if you've thought about this. Whereas if you hadn't been in the hearing room a year ago, you'd never have that chance. And so I think it's fantastic, but Zoom only is horrible. And we do need personal contact with people. Legislators need to work with each other. The press and the lobbyists need to intermingle with the legislators. It's all important.
And my eyes need a break from staring at a Zoom screen.
Holly, jump in. And I also want to ask you, Holly, you talked about adoption, right? We have these three divides. We have the divide around access. We have the divide around affordability, but there's also an adoption divide. And we're moving really quick, right? Into Zoom as a way of engaging democracy, into Zoom as a way of participating in telehealth and accessing health, or recovery and support services. So much is online, and we hear from kids. I hear from kids and teachers and communities day in and day out who are like, my computer is brought to a parking lot. It is a mobile classroom, right? As we know, and a lot of that divide that still exists around those pieces, but specifically the adoption. So I'd love to, whatever you're going to say, but I'd love for you to talk about the consumer protection piece and also the adoption piece.
Well, I'm first going to go back to Michael and talk about the democratization of participation in engagement and governance. This is one of the reasons why we really have to be concerned about looking at access to broadband, including affordability, because if we start making broadband an income-dependent participatory sport, we are, by definition, isolating huge segments of our population. And on this point, I'd really like to eliminate or try to mitigate the problem of the 60,000 as I think about it. Many times we hear reports from the Department of Public Service and others that talk about 60,000 Vermonters being or underserved. That means that they don't have broadband up to the designated speed of 25 megabits per second download and 3 megabits per second upload. Now, by the way, just a tip of the hat to Michael Wood-Lewis, why do we set a standard where the download is bigger than the upload? Well, that's so that commercial companies can sell you content for you to download at a very convenient speed. But what you're uploading, which in the case of a doctor, an architect, anyone who's in a software related business, that upload speed is every bit as important. So there's this question about access to the speed of broadband, but affordability is really key here. And then we have to worry about the fact that 60,000 Vermonters are also low income. So we've got 60,000 people who are un and underserved, and 60,000 people in Vermont who are designated low income, but they're not the same 60,000 people. So the solutions are not the same. And we really have to be careful that we tend to these groups of people in a very mindful way. Now, as to consumer protection and these pieces that we're talking about, I think that we're in a conundrum. When the Telecom Act, as Representative Sims pointed out, passed in 1996 to spur the commerce to grow broadband and telecom of various sorts. That was maybe a great thing for the country and a not so great thing for Vermont. And it has been a challenge for our regulators to understand how to interface with telecom companies. They don't want to get close to anything that smells of regulation. And yet we do have to start establishing standards that are reasonable and both educating and adopting individuals on how we're going to adapt to telecom using standards that make our consumption viable, but also encouraging our regulators to find ways to either embed operating standards in public funds so that public funds do in fact serve the public, and or helping our consumer protection agencies understand what some of our challenges are. But overall, we need to understand how broadband works. And that goes right back to the beginning of the circle here about not creating isolated groups of people who are communicating in one way, where other people with other economic indicators are communicating in a different way.
I'm going to follow up with you on that briefly. Is that a literacy? Is that a training communities, meeting them where they're at, understanding their needs and providing, closing the knowledge gap? How do you see that issue being addressed?
If you're a low-income family, you're not likely to look for another monthly expense to add to the pile, right? And so that impacts your interest and engagement in learning about broadband. And so what we really need to do is take our established relationships in serving low-income communities and build out those relationships to include broadband. Right now, we rely primarily on commercial companies to decide what kind of discount they're going to offer, if any, and how they're going to deliver it. That is really a fraught scenario where we're not looking at the individual that needs to be served as the center of the benefit equation. We're looking at the convenience of the party that's dispensing the benefit. So I think if we start focusing on existing relationship and support and build out broadband support for those relationships, we will be better off.
Thank you. Representative Sims.
Yeah, just got a follow-up question for Holly. With the FCC launching its new subsidy program with $50 a month available for low-income families and the expansion of the Lifeline program to offer the additional broadband subsidy, I'm curious to hear your reflections on those programs and how they might address this issue of affordability, or whether you see additional gaps beyond those programs.
There are gaps, unfortunately. Basically, the emergency broadband benefit, which was passed into law in December of 2020, leveraged off an existing system of reimbursing commercial carriers. So that system is the Lifeline system that was used for regular telephone. And while it's migrating towards broadband, it's very insignificant funding, and it's run, ironically, on the internet. So if you're trying to get internet service and your benefits are on the internet, that's a challenge. Now, the current FCC is making strides in trying to find ways to support people accessing what's called the National Verification System. And you actually, as an individual, need to go into this National Verification System at usac.org and get signed up to verify that you qualify for national subsidies. But it's really the big carriers that are accessing those subsidies. And there are criteria that many of our smaller Vermont carriers don't meet. So we really have to look at this picture and get kind of squared away on how that's going to work for us in Vermont.
Holly, I think what you're touching on in many ways is the system, which is a big part of the broadband proposition, right? who are all the players in this different system? I actually wanted to come back to Michael Birnbaum and Michael Lewis as well. So we have individuals who are in groups who are engaging communities and low-income Vermonters to provide services. We have services, support services, food, all sorts of services. Then we also have our service providers, be it our CUDs or the incumbent service providers, internet service providers, and others. What does a system look like that actually has a level of integration that puts Vermonters, people at the center of the process moving forward? I know that's a big question, and I'm happy to have anyone jump in, but it's a bit of a paradigm shift, I think.
There is some collaboration between different kinds of entities like CUDs and ISPs and telephone companies and cable companies. There's not enough collaboration yet. And I think there will be more, but it depends on what each entity's motivation is. For example, the larger national companies aren't dependent on government funding, direct grant funding, the way H360 anticipates. They get lots of subsidy from the government, but in different ways. But they have much bigger treasure chests, and so they can do what they choose to do. Some of the companies only cherry pick. Other companies, for the telephone companies, have to go everywhere they serve voice, but they don't have to bring broadband to everybody. So there's all these different, the landscape of regulation is a minefield. And there were good things that came of the Act of 1996, but at this point, I think the FCC is going to go back and change it again, and then go through the whole court process again. And eventually, I think we're going to reach some kind of equilibrium where there is some more recognition that these services are a public utility. In the meantime, what do? We need to find like-minded organizations to collaborate, which is the word I started with. We need to have communications union districts, private ISPs, whether they're for-profit or not-for-profit, and cable companies and telephone companies. We should all be sitting at the same table. And I think a summit like this is a model. We can have broadband summits that aren't top down. They could be level, where all these different organizations get together. And summits and conferences historically don't lead to a whole lot. They tend to be a way for people to sort of expend their energy and then go away and feel good and not have done much. So I'm not a Pollyanna about this. It's possible that such a summit would not yield to much, but I think it's worth the effort to seek equity for all of our citizens and to seek ways to avoid things like duplicating services, avoid things like, well, just conflict, avoid conflict between different entities, find ways for them to work together. So that's what I'm suggesting. I think we should set up some kind of a summit between private providers, government entities, municipalities like communications union districts, and see where that leads. We could end up with some work groups that could be really effective.
That's terrific. I'm going to, before moving to Michael and then to Representative Sims, anyone listening, the Q&A box is open. Please put in a question. We'd love to bring more people into this conversation. Thank you all for sticking with us. This has been terrific so far. Michael, over to you.
Yes, I just wanted to add that the internet, smartphones, all the related supporting technology are, beyond compare in the history of humans, and the power that they bring to our fingertips. And of course, power, tends to get concentrated in fewer and fewer fingertips over time. I think in large measure, a lot of us have been asking the question of, wow, this is amazing. What can we do with this? And I think we need to, as a state, as local communities, we need to change that orientation from, wow, look at this crazy set of tools we got. What can we build with it? What can we do with it? Instead, ask, what kind of place do we want to live in? And we have this incredible set of tools. How can we use these tools, the internet, smartphones, et cetera, to build the kind of place we want to, live in, and that we want to raise our kids in, and we want to leave to the next generation? Because these tools are so powerful that they will set their own course if we don't. It requires a much stronger hand than we have employed so far.
I think that's extremely well said. Katherine, do you want to reflect on that or add to the conversation?
Yeah, I just wanted to build a little bit on what Michael was talking about in terms of sort of coordinating all the partners so that we can kind of build the network to serve everyone. And I think, as others have reflected on a number of times, we are certainly hampered a little bit in terms of what we can do from a regulatory perspective. But I want to highlight some of the pieces in H360 that I think help move this conversation forward. So one is, again, this Vermont Community Broadband Board. And so this will be a statewide entity that can help bring some leadership and coordination across all the partners to say, how are we all working together to build a network that serves everyone? And as the federal funds, the public dollars, will be distributed for pre-construction and construction grants, the board will be looking at this concept of a universal service plan, where the communication union district, which is made up of locals from each community on the governance board, will, for their territory, be responsible for creating that universal service plan. And then, for towns and municipalities that are not a part of a communication union district, they will have their own process for creating a universal service plan. But I think this was an important step forward in ensuring that all the partners are working together and not overbuilding in one area and ignoring another. It doesn't mean that the CUD has to do all the work themselves. I don't think we expect that to happen, but that there's public oversight and accountability in terms of ensuring that our federal dollars are going to the places that need it the most, and that creative public-private partnerships can happen to ensure that we're really staying focused on this universal service goal that we have to make sure that all Vermonters are connected. And hope that some of the pieces that we built into H360 help move the needle around this issue that we cannot regulate.
Thank you, Katherine. I do want to bring in Representative Sims, sorry. I do want to bring in some of the questions that have come into the chat and the Q&A box. I see them in both places, which is fine. Holly said earlier about our data, the 60,000 Vermonters who are in underserved or unserved areas, but then a whole other 60,000 group of Vermonters who may not be able to afford broadband access. And there's a lot of questions and comments today around accessibility and affordability and the time it may take to deploy fiber. The question is really around Starlink satellites as a possible solution. And is it possible that it's the true kind of last mile for a lot of homes? The questioner poses, say, where there are less than 10 homes per mile, is this possible? I ask this since the cost per drop increased sharply. I ask this because since the cost per drop increase sharply decreases, I believe, it makes it very unprofitable with less than 10 potential customers per mile. I think, speaking of fiber, is the state monitoring the Starlink beta project in Vermont? I can briefly speak to the second question. I believe the Department of Public Service is monitoring that project, but I kind of opened that question about the tools to this panel and how a sort of new option like Starlink shouldn't be considered possibilities, opportunities, pitfalls. for anyone who wants to start.
Sure.
Holly, go ahead.
Well, and I'd be happy to defer to Michael, but one of the things I see is that there's two questions. What's cost effective near term and to serve the and underserved? And yes, maybe Starlink is a piece of that, although we can't tell when it's going to be generally available, and it is far from perfect, but it is something better than many have. But when we talk about affordability, Starlink is not offering a low income variation, and it is expensive by comparison to other services. So it is a challenge. However, one of the things I've learned in doing this work is that low income families are quite mobile. And so we might want to find ways to ensure that where they are along existing or subsidized fiber routes, we make that service possible. But where they are not, that maybe a wireless or mobile solution is the best solution for them. So I'll hand off to you, Michael Birnbaum.
Well, you did a good job covering it. What we have customers who also have Starlink, and they haven't left us, which is really interesting. And they tend to be customers that are either very technologically nerdy, cutting edge people, or wealthy. Because Holly hit it right on the head. It's a very expensive service. It's $500 plus shipping for the antenna, which is actually a $1,500 antenna, and we don't know what the price will be after the beta period. And it's $100 a month, and we don't know what the price will be after the beta period. And there is also the issue of not that much capacity in the satellites yet. And so initially, almost everyone's getting really good speeds, and it's better than what most Vermonters get. And that's wonderful. It may not last that way as subscription rates increase. People found that with the USDA stimulus wireless provider in the state, that initially the service was wonderful, and then those towers got saturated. And the other thing is that technologically it isn't consistent. It gets interrupted a lot, and so it's challenging to do video conferencing and voice over that technology. But it is, as Holly said, it's better than a lot of alternatives. So that's Starlink, and there will be other companies competing with it. And then there's the question of, do we really want to encourage all those things flying around our Earth, colliding with each other as they decay, and all of that? So it's not the long-term best solution for the world, although it may be great for very isolated regions of the world. So I don't know.
I'd really like to hear what Michael Wood-Lewis thinks about the Starlink solution also, because we're talking about a company that is going to be providing global telecom services. What are we as Vermonters going to do to impact how they behave?
Yeah, well, thanks, Holly. Gee. Yeah, I'm very fortunate to have fiber to the premises for my home and for my office, because and one of the first people in the state to have access to that, because I live and work in Burlington, which is served by Burlington Telecom, formerly a municipally owned fiber telecom, now privately owned. And that last phrase is an area of concern. Not that I have any reason to be concerned about the current owners, but this is critical infrastructure, and retaining local control is crucial. I used to work in the drinking water and wastewater field, and there's a long checkered history of privatizing drinking water utilities in the United States and leading to really bad outcomes. So, yeah, the idea of Starlink is certainly interesting from a technology perspective, but I would look at ownership and control as a first stop. And then there are also, other questions like it's a huge number of satellites they're talking about. And I'm no expert in that, but I'd be very interested to look at a critical evaluation of that model over a longer time frame than like I'm going to get internet quickly. In my individual case. So yeah, it raises a lot of questions.
There's a question in the chat, Michael, picking up sort of where you left off on. There are a lot of open questions about technology, but there are a lot of Vermonters still today don't have access, and questions around, is it going to take 5 years? And what does every day over the next 5 years mean for a kid that can't get online if online learning is a part of our future? Or mother who can't access a telehealth appointment, or some of our older Vermonters, or a peer support group if you're in recovery, or if you're selling goods online, be it car parts or what have you. There is a question on these devices, right? We are walking around with these computers basically, and the question is kind of what incentive do we have to sort of ensure that Vermonters are moving to fiber to the home, if that's the answer, when Vermonters have phones and are using them, right, in a lot of different ways.
Is that for me?
For anyone, Michael, sure.
Sure. Well, the first thing is that Vermonters know that Vermont is poorly covered by cells, by mobile wireless. I mean, it's certainly well covered in a lot of places, but not geographically 100%. It's not even remotely close, despite what the carrier's maps show. And therefore, there are lots of people who do have those mobile devices, but they have to drive somewhere in order to use them. And then secondly, the model that those kinds of carriers use, the economic model they use, is to sell data. And that's limited. And it gets very expensive. Each phone is serving one member of the family, and you have a data bucket for the month, and it gets very expensive. So understandably, if you have limited income and you cannot take on that extra monthly bill that Holly was referring to, you may only have the mobile device. And but this is an expensive solution for them. And so it's a stopgap. It's not a solution. I don't think, I saw the question, I don't think we need to go out and convince them to get a computer. I think that we're going to provide better service to their homes, set up good subsidy programs, and then we won't have to convince them. Although, let me say one more thing. There were two programs that didn't make it into H360, both of which ought to have. One was the Vermont Broadband Core, or maybe I'm mistaken. Representative Sims, did that get in? I don't think it did. And the other one was, what was it called? Broadband Equity Now, which was similar to Holly's Equal Access to Broadband. Both of those programs would have facilitated a lot more access and done a lot of training and a lot of outreach. Those are good programs, and the politics weren't right, but they should come back in January, and something like that should be funded in the state.
Representative Sims, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I'll just build on what Michael was saying. I think we certainly don't need to dictate whether people should be using a home computer or a cell phone. Everyone should make a choice that's right for them and their family. But I think everyone should be able to make that choice. And right now, if you don't have a connection, or you have a connection but you can't afford to connect, or you can't afford a device, then you don't have the choice. And Michael highlighted some of the programs available. I also just want to shout out to our libraries who have done incredible work over this pandemic to sort of extend Wi-Fi access at their facilities, and also a number of them putting together lending library programs for digital devices, so that if you can't afford a laptop, you might have access to one at your local library. And I think that's something that we want to continue to expand, so that purchasing a device isn't a barrier, as well as making sure that our network reaches everyone and that folks have a plan that they can afford. And just sort of one final thought about some of the pieces that didn't make it into H360 that Michael mentioned. The legislation does call for some additional reporting, looking at, FirstNet, our program that connects libraries, and also digital inclusion efforts. And so we hope that we'll be getting some good recommendations about how we can continue to stay focused not only on building the network, but ensuring affordability, and that we have all of the programs and supports in place to help build digital literacy and help everyone access the programs that are available.
Michael Wood.
I would just like to offer a perspective as an employer. So Front Porch Forum has about 24 employees scattered across Vermont. And we recently did a survey to try to get a better handle on what's going on, because of course everybody works remotely right now, and that's been our history even before the pandemic largely. And about a third of our staff have modern broadband access, 100 up, 100 down. About a third meet the more minimal definition of 25 and 3, but a third are below that. And no surprise, like kind of the light bulb went on over our head. That's the third of our staff who we're always struggling to get patched in, and they're the ones scrambling to go to the library and to find a place where they can connect. They're the ones who we're having conversations with about their cell phone and how is that part of their job or not. And it's hard as an employer. But there's also this other axis which breaks down, the numbers are a little different, but we do have kind of 3 groups of the super tech savvy, including our software engineers and others, those who are technologically just very competent and solid and strong. And then other folks on our staff for whom technology is really a constant source of challenge, where they're very good at what they do, their particular role in our organization. But as soon as the software changes, as soon as there's a connectivity glitch or whatever, they need support and help. And I got to believe this is largely the case, across the general population too. So this Whova platform we're on today, fascinating, very cool, and complicated. And I'm sure there are those of us who are geeking out and, using every feature, and there are those who are just getting by, but there are those who probably aren't able to participate because it's too complicated. And, I just put that on the table that, and I think Lieutenant Governor, you mentioned something to this effect earlier too. It's access, it's affordability, but it's also having the capacity in a home to take advantage of these tools.
Thank you, Michael. I'm going to go to Holly, you next as part of our wrap up. I've just been given the cue that we have 3 minutes, and I feel like we're just getting into a lot. But there was a question from a panelist in Essex County, and the question is really around how do you, if you were in Essex County, in a state that needs people to move to Essex County where there's no broadband, how do you really address and win over equity and inclusion? So if panelists are willing to reflect on that in their concluding remarks, I'd appreciate it. I just want to pull a couple of themes, and I'm going to give you all the last word. But on the proposition, I think there's a big question around data, making sure that our data is accurate. This is Holly's point, 60,000 without access, 60,000 Vermonters who may be low income, and making sure that we're talking about affordability and accessibility, making sure that there's questions around standards, standards that apply to consumer protection, standards that apply to ensuring Vermonters do have good access. I really liked Michael Wood, what you said, Lewis, around what kind of place do we want to live in, and starting there in this conversation as we rapidly move towards closing the digital divide. also removing these barriers and a lot of the complexities to participating, right? Be it participating in a committee hearing, as Representative Sims says, or in a school function, or even in a summit, right? A virtual summit online. A lot of conversation around collaboration throughout systems, making sure that we're addressing those who are accessing, those who are providing services, and all the forms in our process, and making sure that we center people, Vermonters, in the process. So with that, Holly, starting with you, any reflections coming out of the panel, whatever you'd like to share, we'll start and go around and wrap up.
Lieutenant Governor, you posed a question about adoption. And what we saw during COVID is that teachers, doctors, dentists, therapists, select board members, everybody was heavily engaged in the learning curve of adoption. Now, it is true that there were some proposals put on the table for H360, but they were short-term and short window support services. And we really need to plan for that in the next legislative session for ensuring that we're all connected, because when we don't have adoption and we don't have affordability, we really are not connected. In this realm, necessity will be the mother of invention, because we need to convince even the select boards in Essex County that this is not an expense that is a potential benefit. It is here, it is now, it's a necessary benefit. Thanks for having me today. I really
Thank you. Thank you for sharing so much of your expertise. Representative Sims.
Yeah, thank you all for this lively conversation and the questions from our participants. This is such a moment for Vermont, for us to really take important learning from COVID and match it with this once in a lifetime federal stimulus to make sure that we are reaching all Vermonters. And we are really just getting started. We've, got a bit of a frame with H360, and we have a lot of resources to move and a lot of miles to build. And, so grateful for our federal delegation for all their work advocating for resources and programs that really serve rural communities. And I guess we've touched on in a number of different ways. There's work still to do to ensure accountability and oversight, and that rural communities are not left behind and we can ensure equitable access. I think as we go into this next year, I hope that we can all stay really focused on that last mile, the Essex County that we heard about. We need to prioritize those communities that have historically been underserved, so that we are not leaving anyone behind, ensuring access to this critical infrastructure that we all depend on every day. So thanks for the chance to be here with you all and engage in this really interesting conversation.
Thank you, Representative. Michael Birnbaum.
I love it that each of us represents a different aspect of broadband, but we pretty much agree on all of it. We all care about what kind of a place we live in. We all care about affordability, and we all care about access, and we all care about good government. So I'm in the access business. So in answer to the Essex County question, we participated in the FCC auction this past year and won considerable support to serve Essex County. We're looking forward to doing that.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Michael Wood-Lewis, no pressure. Last word goes to you.
Well, thank you. So yeah, a real pleasure to participate on this. We could have had a very similar version of this conversation a year and a half ago, minus the federal money, of course. But, 2020 had a massive impact across the world and across our state in many ways. But one way pertinent to today's discussion is it moved so much of so many of us, our lives online. And, thank goodness we had these online tools and people working hard, and really was a godsend in many ways. And I think we should work very hard to reverse that. I think we need to get offline. I think our kids need to be in classrooms. They need to be hands-on. We need to be outdoors. We need to be in community with our neighbors. We need to be shopping at Main Street. local businesses. We need to be volunteering at local nonprofits in person as soon as it's safe and as soon as we can. That's the kind of life I want to see here. And I have some concerns that a lasting legacy of COVID-19 might be a strangling of in-person life. And I would hope that any work we do here around broadband will keep that in consideration, that broadband is a tool to use to building the kind of communities we all want to live in.
Thank you, Michael. I want to just close by thanking Paul Costello and Jenna and Margaret, everyone who worked so hard to put on this virtual summit. It's an incredible amount of work. Thank you, panelists. Thank you for all your expertise. As your Lieutenant Governor, I'll put that hat fully back on and just say that I really believe if we get this right here in Vermont, we can be a model for the nation on how to do that, preserving our communities, preserving democracy, preserving a lot of access to each other and to a really robust, thriving state while transforming into a place where there's a lot of equity and accessibility. So thank you so much. I know this is recorded, so if anyone missed it, I'm sure it will be posted. But I wish you all a wonderful rest of the week and thank you for all the work you do.